let me start by asking you a pretty simple trivia question. If you are sitting there listening to this, how many bones are inside your body right now?
I mean, if your brain immediately supplied the number 206, you are in excellent company.
Hmm.
That is, the standard universal textbook answer we all get taught.
Right. But what if I told you that number is actually a massive biological myth?
It really is. I mean, we are so deeply conditioned by those, like, plastic models hanging in the corner of a science classroom or a doctor's office.
Oh, yeah, totally. The guy hanging on the metal stand.
Exactly. And they present the human skeleton as this fixed, unchangeable framework, just a piece of dead scaffolding. But the biological reality of your skeletal system is infinitely messier, highly variable, and honestly far more fascinating than a neat count of 206 standardized parts.
Okay, let's unpack this because today we are taking a deep dive into the human skeleton. We've gathered a huge stack of incredible anatomical research, biomechanical studies, and some really wild historical sources.
Some very dark historical sources, to
Yeah.
be honest.
Yeah, seriously. And our mission today is to fundamentally change how you view your own internal framework. We're going to break down what your skeleton actually is and how centuries of anatomists literally had to dig up bodies in the dark just to figure it out.
Plus, we'll get into the hidden jobs your bones are doing at this exact second.
Right. And why this all matters for astronauts, forensic scientists, and, your own long-term health.
Yeah, because we really need to abandon the idea of the skeleton as some static Halloween decoration.
Yeah.
What we're really talking about is a highly dynamic living system.
It's constantly changing.
Exactly. I mean, your skeleton is an endocrine organ, it's a mineral reservoir, and a blood manufacturing plant, all wrapped into a mechanical lever system that is, get this, constantly remodeling itself.
So let's start by dismantling that 206 number. To even arrive at a count, we kind of have to define what a skeleton is in the first place, right?
Right.
Humans have an endoskeleton. That's an internal frame of bone and cartilage, which operates completely differently than, say, the external exoskeletons you see on insects or crabs.
Yeah, and traditional anatomy usually splits our internal framework into two main divisions. First, you have the axial skeleton.
Which is the core, right?
Exactly, the central core. That's 80 bones forming the skull, the vertebral column, the ribs, and the sternum.
And then branching off from that core is the appendicular skeleton. Those are the remaining 126 bones dedicated to movement and, interacting with the world.
So that includes your upper and lower limbs, plus the shoulder girdles and pelvic girdles that anchor those limbs back to the central axis.
And when you do the math, 80 plus 126, you get 206. But looking at the research, it makes it abundantly clear that this number is really just a rounded off population level convenience. I mean, the person listening to this right now might have 205 bones or, I don't know, 212.
Oh, almost certainly. Let's look at sesamoid bones, for instance.
Okay, what are those?
These are specialized bones that grow completely embedded within tendons. Usually they show up where a tendon passes over a joint to protect it and increase its mechanical leverage.
Oh, like the kneecap.
Yes, exactly. Everyone has a pair of large sesamoid bones, your patellae, the kneecaps. But many people develop smaller, additional sesamoid bones in their hands and feet. And that's based purely on the mechanical stress they experience over their lifetime.
Wait, really? So, like, a concert pianist or a marathon runner might develop an entirely different count of these bones than someone else?
Yeah, exactly. The count shifts just based on your lifestyle and your specific biomechanics.
That is wild. And then there are structural variations you were just born with, too, particularly in the spine?
Right. So at the base of your spine, the sacrum is normally a fusion of 5 vertebrae. And the coccyx, the tailbone, is a fusion of 3 to 5. But that exact number of segments varies quite a bit.
It's not a hard rule.
Not at all. You frequently see a condition called sacralization, where the last lumbar vertebra in the lower back, fully or partially, fuses to the sacrum. And that effectively reduces your overall bone count.
And the opposite can happen too, right?
Yeah, it's called lumbarization, where the first sacral segment basically refuses to fuse and just stays entirely separate.
Wow. I was actually shocked to read in the sources about extra ribs, too. Roughly 1 in 200 people has a supernumerary rib.
It's fairly common, all things considered.
Yeah, it's typically a cervical rib that forms attached to the 7th neck vertebra, just sitting above the collarbone.
That is a perfect example. And, the skull has its own eccentricities. As the major plates of the skull grow together during development, they form these jagged suture lines.
Kind of like tectonic plates.
Yes, sort of. And sometimes small, irregular islands of bone form completely independently within those suture lines, usually at the back of the head. We call these Wormian bones or sutural bones. Some people have none, some people have a dozen.
It really makes the 206 number feel like a car manufacturer's estimated MPG, you know?
That's a great way to put it.
It's an average convenience, but it's definitely not a biological guarantee for the specific model you're driving. Like, if an anatomy textbook is titled 205 bones, it's not actually factually incorrect.
Not at all. And what's fascinating here is that to make the definition even more complex, a purely bone-based count ignores cartilage completely.
Oh, right.
And cartilage is essential skeletal tissue. Your entire embryonic skeleton was initially sculpted out of cartilage before it ossified into bone.
And we still have a bunch of it as adults.
Exactly. It structurally forms your nose, your ears, your trachea, and it provides those vital friction-reducing surfaces for literally all your joints. Leaving it out of the skeletal equation just gives a very incomplete picture.
Which honestly raises an incredible historical question for me. Since our individual bone counts vary so much and the inclusion of cartilage makes things super muddy, how did science ever establish a standard human model in the first place?
Yeah, it was a chaotic, centuries-long process of trial, error, and overcoming intense cultural taboos.
Yeah, you aren't kidding about the taboos.
Systematic human dissection actually traces back to Herophilus of Chalcedon in Alexandria, around 300 BCE. He was a real pioneer in mapping the human interior. Though, historical accounts note he reportedly resorted to vivisection on condemned criminals.
Which is, a very dark origin for the discipline. Brutal stuff.
Yeah, brutal practice that was eventually banned. But his early anatomical maps laid the groundwork for Galen of Pergamon a few hundred years later, in the 2nd century CE. And Galen's anatomical texts ended up dominating Western medicine for an astonishing 1,300 years.
But Galen's legacy was built on a massive structural flaw, right? Because under Roman law, human dissection was strictly forbidden.
Exactly. So Galen couldn't legally look inside humans. Instead, he relied on dissecting animals, primarily Barbary macaques and pigs, and then he just systematically extrapolated that animal anatomy onto the human body.
I just want to pause on that for a second because the implications are wild. For over a millennium, physicians were treating human patients based on the internal anatomy of a pig.
It's mind-boggling. And it resulted in deeply embedded errors that no one questioned. For instance, Galen wrote that the human lower jawbone was made of 2 separate fused pieces.
Which is true for pigs.
Right. It is biologically true for dogs and pigs, but it is entirely false for humans. We have a single, unified mandible.
How did no one notice that for 1,300 years? If someone breaks their jaw, you can clearly see it's one solid bone.
It really speaks to the terrifying power of established authority. When the foundational texts of your entire medical system say the jaw has 2 bones, you just interpret every fracture or piece of visual evidence to fit that pre-existing narrative.
Wow, confirmation bias on a massive scale.
Exactly. Private observation rarely overturns public dogma unless someone is willing to risk their reputation and potentially their life to actually contest it.
And that decisive rupture finally happened in 1543, right, with Andreas Vesalius?
Yes, a Flemish physician at the University of Padua. He published a monumental 7-volume atlas of human anatomy called the Humani Corporis Fabrica.
And Vesalius realized that to understand the human body, you had to physically look at the human body. So he completely rejected the animal proxies.
He did. He would famously venture out at night to retrieve bodies from the gallows to conduct direct, painstaking human dissections. He publicly cataloged and corrected over 200 of Galen's specific errors, including the jawbone mistake.
The illustrations in his book are iconic, by the way. These highly detailed, completely accurate human skeletons posed standing in lush landscapes, like leaning on spades or contemplating skulls. But wait, I've always wondered about the timeline here.
Okay, what do you mean?
I thought Leonardo da Vinci was doing brilliant, perfectly accurate human dissections during the Renaissance, which was a full generation before Vesalius. Was his work just ignored?
Well, it wasn't ignored. It was largely unknown. Da Vinci's private anatomical notebooks were staggering in their brilliance and accuracy, but he never formally published them in his lifetime.
Oh, I see.
And this highlights a core philosophy of science, right? Private brilliance does not move a field forward. Public, contestable claims do. Vesalius laid his findings bare for the world to test, debate, and verify. He broke that 1,300-year spell of authority by demanding that evidence take precedence over habit.
Okay, so Vesalius finally gives us an accurate map. We know the shapes, we know the approximate count, but let's dive into what these structures are actually doing right now, because we really have to shatter the misconception that bones are just inert calcium
Oh,
sticks.
absolutely. Your bones are extraordinarily active, living tissue. They're teeming with cellular life.
There are three main types of cells, right?
Yeah. You have osteoblasts, which are the specialized cells that constantly build new bone matrix. You have osteocytes, which are mature cells embedded deep inside the bone that act like sensors monitoring mechanical stress and fluid flow. And then you have osteoclasts, which secrete enzymes and acids to actually break down and resorb old bone tissue.
So they are effectively a continuous construction site, constantly tearing down and rebuilding.
Precisely. Through the synchronized work of those osteoblasts and osteoclasts, it is estimated that your adult skeleton completely replaces its entire matrix roughly every decade.
Which means the skeleton you are sitting in right now is literally not the one you had 10 years ago. That is so cool. And while this tissue is constantly turning over, it is simultaneously executing 6 critical physiological jobs.
Right.
So let's look at the first two, support and protection. And I want anyone listening to this to just shift their posture for a second and sit up straight. When you do that, you are engaging an incredible piece of biological engineering, the vertebral column.
It is an absolute masterpiece of load distribution because it isn't a straight, rigid rod.
Right, it's curvy.
Exactly. It's a stack of 33 vertebrae featuring 24 articulating ones resting on the fused sacrum and coccyx. And it forms 4 distinct alternating curves: the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral curves.
It functions exactly like a biological spring. I mean, if an architect tried to build a load-bearing pillar for a skyscraper by stacking irregular S-curved blocks cushioned by little pads, they'd be fired instantly.
Oh, without a doubt.
But in biology, that spring design absorbs the compressive shock of a lifetime of walking, running, and jumping far better than a straight pole ever could.
And the same genius design applies to protection. The cranium uses 8 interlocking flat bones, and the facial skeleton uses 14 to form a vault for the brain. But look at the rib cage. It uses 12 pairs of ribs, the sternum, and the thoracic vertebrae to protect the heart and lungs.
If you take a deep breath right now, you can feel your chest expand.
Exactly.
Because protection usually implies rigidity, like a steel safe. But if your rib cage was a rigid safe, you would just suffocate. I like to look at the rib cage as an organic, self-healing, high-tech shock absorber rather than a medieval cage.
And the ribs achieve that flexibility because they attach to the sternum using strips of costal cartilage. They act as hinged struts. They have to smoothly expand and contract 12 to 20 times a minute every minute of your life.
That is hundreds of millions of cycles over a lifetime.
Exactly. Any metal spring subjected to that relentless repetitive motion would eventually suffer structural fatigue and snap. Your ribs just continuously adapt and flex.
Which brings us to the third job, movement. And it's important to clarify, bones themselves don't initiate movement. They act as the levers.
Right. The joints or articulations are the pivot points, and the skeletal muscles generate the pulling force across those pivots.
And the biomechanical forces at play there are immense. The femur, the massive bone in your thigh, can withstand compressive forces roughly 30 times your body weight during a full-speed sprint.
It's incredible. And it achieves that strength without even being solid all the way through.
Let's talk about how they actually grow and form to handle that weight, because bone development is fascinating. It's not just a single process, is it?
No, it's not. The body uses 2 completely different manufacturing techniques called ossification.
Okay.
So for the flat bones, like the plates of your skull, the body uses intramembranous ossification. Bone develops directly from sheets of primitive connective tissue. But for the long bones, like your femur or humerus, it uses endochondral ossification.
Wait, so it starts as cartilage first?
Exactly. The body first sculpts a complete miniature model of the bone out of hyaline cartilage, and then systematically invades that cartilage with blood vessels and replaces it with solid bone from the inside out.
Wow. And that cartilage model is why children can grow taller, right? They retain an epiphyseal plate, a growth plate of active cartilage near the ends of those long bones.
Right. The cartilage keeps multiplying, and the bone keeps chasing it, replacing it from behind, until you reach your late teens or early 20s, and the plates finally fully ossify.
So that's the structural side. But the fourth job of the skeleton is entirely chemical: mineral storage and homeostasis. I like to think of the skeleton as a massive physiological checking account. It stores about 99% of your body's calcium, alongside vast amounts of phosphorus.
And you are constantly making deposits and withdrawals from that account. Your nervous system and your muscles absolutely require a highly specific concentration of calcium in the blood just to function.
So what happens if it drops?
If your blood calcium drops, a signal is sent to your parathyroid glands. They release parathyroid hormone, which acts as a withdrawal slip. It commands those bone-destroying cells, the osteoclasts, to ramp up their activity, dissolving a tiny bit of bone matrix and releasing that stored calcium back into the bloodstream to keep your heart beating and your nerves firing.
Man, the bone is in a continuous high-stakes chemical conversation with the rest of the body. And deep inside that bone is where the fifth job happens, blood cell production or hematopoiesis.
Yes. Inside the porous, spongy cavities of certain bones, primarily the pelvis, the sternum, the vertebrae, and the proximal ends of the femur and humerus, you have red bone marrow. This is a highly dynamic manufacturing center.
But how does it actually know what to make? It's not just blindly pumping out blood, right?
Not at all. It's highly responsive. The marrow contains hematopoietic stem cells. These are unspecialized cells capable of transforming into whatever the body needs.
Oh, I see.
So if your kidneys detect low oxygen levels, they secrete a hormone that tells the marrow to churn out more red blood cells to carry oxygen. If you contract an infection, chemical signals prompt those stem cells to rapidly differentiate into various white blood cells to fight the invader. It also manufactures the platelets you need to clot wounds.
This is exactly why hematologists perform bone marrow biopsies in the pelvis or sternum for patients with leukemia. To fix blood cancers, you have to go straight to the source where the blood is actually synthesized.
Exactly.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Job number 6, endocrine signaling.
Oh, this was a massive paradigm-shifting discovery for anatomy. In the 2000s, a geneticist named Gerard Carcenti and his team at Columbia University proved that the skeleton actually functions as an endocrine organ.
A hormone generated by the bone itself.
Right. They discovered that those bone-building cells, the osteoblasts, actively secrete a hormone called osteocalcin.
And what blew my mind when researching this was the why behind it. Building and remodeling bone requires massive amounts of cellular energy. So the skeleton needs a way to guarantee it gets the fuel it requires.
That's exactly the biological logic.
Yeah.
Osteocalcin travels through the bloodstream directly to the pancreas, where it stimulates the production of insulin. It also travels to fat tissue to release another hormone called adiponectin.
So by boosting insulin, the skeleton effectively tells the body cells to pull glucose out of the blood and use it for energy, ensuring the osteoblasts have the massive energy reserves they need to keep laying down new bone matrix.
It is a perfectly closed, elegant feedback loop. The skeleton demands the fuel it needs to build itself. That completely obliterates the concept of bones as passive scaffolding.
It really does. So what does this all mean? Knowing how incredibly dynamic this system is, how does it react to extreme mechanical environments?
Well, to understand that, we look at the principle of bone functional adaptation, historically known as Wolff's Law. In the late 19th century, Julius Wolff proposed that bone remodels itself in direct response to the mechanical loads placed upon it.
But if it's universally known as a law, why do modern scientists think Wolff kind of overreached? Modern biomechanists have largely moved away from calling it a strict law, haven't they?
They have. Wolff proposed a highly specific, rigid mathematical formula for exactly how the trabeculae, the spongy inner struts of the bone, align themselves. But biology is far too messy and multifaceted for one perfect mathematical equation.
So what's actually happened?
We now understand the mechanism behind it, which is called mechanotransduction. When you put weight on a bone, it microscopically bends. This forces fluid through the tiny canals inside the bone matrix. Those embedded sensor cells, the osteocytes, detect that fluid flow, interpret it as mechanical stress, and chemically signal the osteoblasts to lay down more bone exactly where it's needed.
So heavily loaded bone thickens and unloaded bone is resorbed. And the ultimate extreme test of this adaptation is spaceflight.
Yes. When astronauts enter the microgravity environment of the International Space Station, they're entirely freed from the relentless mechanical loading of Earth's gravity.
The ultimate unloading.
Right. The osteocytes stop sensing that fluid flow. The osteoblasts slow down, but the osteoclasts just keep working. As a result, astronauts can lose up to 1% to 2% of their bone mineral density per month in space.
Per month. That is a brutal demonstration of biological efficiency. The body just refuses to waste vital energy maintaining dense, heavy bone if the mechanical environment doesn't demand it.
Exactly. It's why NASA mandates hours of intense resistance exercise on the ISS, and why bone density is a massive physiological hurdle for any multi-year mission to Mars.
Now, human understanding of the skeleton hasn't always been a smooth, upward trajectory of discoveries. The drive to classify bones has led to some spectacular failures of scientific rigor, most notably during the Bone Wars.
Ah, the bone wars of the late 19th century.
Yeah, this was an intensely bitter, almost theatrical rivalry between two American paleontologists, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh. They were completely obsessed with discovering and naming the most dinosaur species in the American West.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the competition was so fierce they reportedly spied on each other, stole fossils, and even ordered their teams to dynamite dig sites just to prevent the other from finding anything.
Which is insane.
It is, but the real casualty was scientific accuracy. Because they were in an absolute frenzy to publish and claim academic glory, they made massive, embarrassing anatomical errors.
Right. In one of the most famous blunders in the history of paleontology, Marsh's team was reconstructing an Apatosaurus skeleton. They were missing the skull, so they just hastily slapped on a skull they found nearby, which actually belonged to a completely different, unrelated dinosaur called a Camarasaurus.
And because of their immense academic authority, that Frankenstein's monster of a skeleton just sat in museums and textbooks as scientific fact for nearly a century before it was definitively corrected.
That's embarrassing.
The Bone Wars are a vivid historical warning. Assembling a full, correct skeleton from scattered fragments is painstakingly difficult work. When you inject extreme reputational pressure or the rush to publish, the rigor required to understand anatomy degrades rapidly.
And that need for extreme rigor translates directly into the modern stakes of forensic anthropology.
Absolutely. Think back to our earlier discussion on human variation, like the extra ribs or sesamoid bones. If a forensic anthropologist is analyzing skeletal remains from a mass disaster or an archaeological site, they are faced with an incredibly complex puzzle.
Because they have to figure out what's normal and what's not.
Right. They have to determine if an extra bone is a normal sutural variation, a piece of calcified soft tissue, a sign of severe trauma, or, most critically, evidence of commingled remains, where bones from multiple different individuals have been mixed together.
Misinterpreting a normal variation could completely derail a forensic identification. And, speaking of interpreting skeletons correctly, we should clear up a common misconception about human development. You often hear the trivia fact that babies have way more bones than adults.
That is true. A newborn infant has roughly 270 to 300 separate bony and cartilaginous elements.
But as you age into an adult, you don't magically lose 90 bones. They don't just vanish.
No, they fuse. The spaces between the cranial plates ossify and lock together. The hip bone is a perfect example of this. In a child, the pelvis consists of 3 distinctly separate bones: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, all joined by cartilage.
And then they grow together.
Right. By the time you reach your late teens or early 20s, that cartilage ossifies, and they fuse into one solid adult hip bone, the os coxae. That final adult count of roughly 206 is simply the end result of all that developmental fusion.
But the internal remodeling never stops, which brings us to the clinical reality of osteoporosis. Because even after you stop growing physically, your bones are constantly shifting density.
Osteoporosis occurs when the delicate balance between bone creation and bone destruction falls out of sync. The osteoclasts begin breaking down bone tissue faster than the osteoblasts can rebuild it, leaving the bones highly porous and dangerously brittle.
And this disproportionately affects postmenopausal women, right?
It does, because estrogen plays a critical role in regulating and inhibiting osteoclast activity. When estrogen levels drop significantly after menopause, the osteoclasts are basically unleashed.
This is a major driver of devastating hip and spinal fractures in older adults, which drastically impacts their independence and overall mortality. It's why routine DEXA scans, dual-energy X-ray absorptiometry, are used to precisely measure bone mineral density.
Exactly.
And it ties directly back to functional adaptation, right? Engaging in weight-bearing exercise throughout your life forces your osteocytes to keep signaling the osteoblast to build, creating a denser bank account of bone to draw from later in life.
That distinction is exactly why we separate the fields of study. Osteology is the scientific study of the bones themselves, their structure, function, and history.
Yeah.
While orthopedics is the specialized medical and surgical field dedicated to treating the disorders of the skeletal system, repairing those fractures, and managing diseases like osteoporosis.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started by dismantling a fake number, the rigid idea that 206 bones is a biological absolute. and looked at how sesamoid bones, extracervical ribs, and sacral fusions make your exact framework completely unique.
We trace the history from grave-robbing anatomists correcting a millennium of pig-based errors all the way down into the microscopic cavities of your marrow where your immune system is manufactured.
We examine the skeleton not as dead scaffolding, but as an endocrine organ actively regulating your blood sugar, a massive mineral reservoir balancing your body's chemistry, and a mechanical marvel constantly sensing gravity and adapting to the forces you place on it.
It fundamentally changes the experience of simply sitting in your own body, doesn't it?
Hmm.
You are operating a continuously self-repairing, highly communicative biological machine.
It is a remarkable system.
It really is. And, I want to leave you with a final philosophical twist to mull over on your own. We discussed how your osteoblasts and osteoclasts are relentlessly turning over your bone matrix, completely recycling and replacing your adult skeleton roughly every decade.
Right, the 10-year cycle.
Think about the classic thought experiment, the ship of Theseus. If a wooden ship slowly has every single plank, sail, and mast replaced over time, is it fundamentally the same ship?
Oh, wow.
Because your skeletal framework is entirely recycled, you are quite literally not walking around in the same skeleton you had 10 years ago. So, in a physical structural sense, who is actually carrying you through life today?